I am Tamar Shalom, and this is Jewish Crossroads. When journalist Joshua Leifer recently launched his new book, Tablets Shattered, The End of an American Jewish Century and the Future of Jewish Life, he knew it might spark backlash. After all, the book delivers a sharp and unapologetic critique of the Jewish establishment, the major Jewish organizations, and the Jewish educational system that shaped him. What he certainly didn't anticipate, however, was that the Brooklyn bookstore hosting his launch event would cancel it at the last minute because the Reform rabbi he had invited to the conversation was a Zionist. I'm delighted to have Joshua on the podcast today, both to discuss this incident and what it bears with it, and to dive into his thought-provoking book, which analyzes the forces behind the crisis of American Jewry in recent decades. Leifer's essays and reporting have appeared widely in international publications, including the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, the Atlantic, the Guardian, Haaretz, and many more. He is a member of the Dissent editorial board and is currently pursuing a history PhD at Yale University. Recently, his book received the Modern Jewish Thought and Experience Award at the 74th National Jewish Book Awards. Shalom, Joshua. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So for our listeners who may not be familiar with the story, let's take it back to the launch event last summer. I imagine you were excited leading up to it. And then what happens?
You know, I mean, there's still a part of me that thinks, well, it's a shame that this whole affair has kind of overshadowed the launch of the book. But basically, around an hour before we were set to go to the event, I got a call through my publicist that the bookstore shift manager had concerns about the politics of Rabbi Andy Bachman, who was going to be my interlocutor for the event. And I had chosen Andy for a range of reasons. He's a former teacher of mine, but also, even though the book is very critical of the mainstream American Jewish life, I also wanted to be in conversation with people from the mainstream of American Jewish life. And the manager said, you know, the line changed from we have some concerns about Andy to, well, we can't have Andy on stage because he's a Zionist. And I showed up to the bookstore itself, talked to this person, and they reiterated that they would not put a Zionist on stage. I think, you know, I don't know whether they knew actually who Andy was. I think if they had, maybe they wouldn't have done this because he's kind of like, he's like the Pope of liberal Judaism in Brooklyn. And so very quickly, the story took on a life of its own. I guess that's probably how a lot of people heard about the book, because if it was, I mean, I joke that like the book would have probably gone under the radar if it wasn't for this whole incident.
You should send her flowers, after all.
Yeah, I joked to send her a gift basket.
Where did the event take place eventually?
Eventually, the event took place at, I think it's called the Center for New Jewish Culture, which is part of Congregation Beth Elohim, which happened to be the Reform congregation where Rabbi Bachman had worked previously.
What was your first emotional reaction? I mean, when it happened?
It was initially disbelief. I mean, the way the phone call went down was I get a call from my publicist. She's saying, you know, the venue has some concerns about Andy. We heard he's a Zionist. And I said to her, well, tell them that, you know, we're not going to discuss anything that's not in the book. And the book involves an ongoing debate with people who may define themselves as Zionists, as many in the American Jewish community do. And I said, you know, tell them that they can trust me, that the conversation will stay within the, you know, limits of acceptable progressive opinion. I think they were worried that he would say something that they would find like insightful or whatever. I don't really know. In the end, it was just a pretense. I mean, also in retrospect, it took us a very long time to line up a venue for the book launch. And in retrospect, I think it probably had to do a little bit with the subject matter of the book in this political climate where, to put it mildly, there's not a lot of interest in American Jewish identity outside of the American Jewish community.
And I guess there's a fair bit of irony in the fact that a book that opens with you covering a protest against occupation in a Palestinian village ended up being boycotted at its launch by this bookstore. I mean, it feels like a sign of the times, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it does. I think that the book tried to walk a line that I think it successfully walked, but also paid a price for it, in the sense that I wasn't going to spare any criticism that I have of the Israeli government and of its policies and of the occupation. On the other hand, I was going to try to speak very frankly and directly to a Jewish audience, not only, but also largely. And in the end, I think the discursive terrain was so polarized that people heard only the things that they didn't want to hear and generalized about the book from there. So the Wall Street Journal reviews the book and calls it anti-Israel, even though I think that that's a terrible mischaracterization of the book, and also of me, kind of irresponsible too, because I describe like my lifelong traveling between Israel as part of the book. And so I don't think you could call it anti-Israel. On the other hand, the radical left read the book and called me like an ethno-nationalist. And so I think it's one of these things where like, how could it be both? And and I do think that that reflects just the lack of nuance that our current conversation, that's a feature of our current moment.
The event was canceled because of your guest, not because of you.
Right.
Would you define yourself as a Zionist if they had asked you directly?
So it's funny, I've gotten this question a lot in like the 5 months since the book launched. I think that's a complicated question because the people who have taken ownership of the term Zionist have defined it in really restrictive ways. And so if someone says to me, Zionism means military occupation over millions of Palestinians, then I can't define myself as a Zionist. But if Zionism means the Jewish right to collective self-determination, then I am a Zionist. And I think that the Jewish community in America, but also in Israel, has done itself a disservice on these things, where you have people who say the occupation is intrinsic to what Israel is. And so if you criticize the occupation, you're criticizing the essence of Israel. And I'm actually the one who's saying, no, I don't think that those things are essential to Jewish collective self-determination. I don't think that Jewish collective self-determination has to look the way it does now. Part of this is part of the story that I try to tell in the book, which is that I think if there had been more room within American Jewish life for dissent and different kinds of opinions, I don't think I would have ended up in as adversarial position as I like passed through my young adulthood in this. And part of the irony also was that I would come back from time in Israel, read Haaretz, speak to people. I was lived there for a time, come back and be like, the things that are normal, not in the radical left, but things that are normal to say, like within your good liberal Tel Aviv community, you can't say it couldn't say in the community that I grew up in. And so it was this strange, that's been a long running thing, but there was more freedom. That might change. I don't know, whatever, we'll see. But in some ways, like the lack of space for a nuanced, critical, I would even say adult relationship to Israel meant that definitions of things like Zionism became very one-dimensional and restrictive.
Going back to the bookstore incident, I feel like this whole thing ties into the disappointment you talk about in your book about some of your progressive friends, including Jewish allies in the movement, who you say failed a critical test on October 7th. What was that test and how did they fail it?
As I understood the role of, let's say, the Jewish anti-occupation movement in the United States up until October 7th, and I think I'll just put in brackets that anti-occupation is not a term you hear very much anymore. In some ways, the political conversation has surpassed that. And that's why I think terms like Zionism, like at stake is no longer the occupation. At stake is like the question of, do you believe that Israel should exist? And to me, that wasn't a question when I was coming out into the world of activism. The question was, we want Israel to be a just state. The occupation exists, so we have to end the occupation. And I think that the test on October 7th was being able to communicate to the Jewish communities that we wanted to change, and that also many of us came from, that we were mourning with them. I don't think this is just a matter of tactics or strategy. It was also real. Like I and my wife, like we were mourning with people. But because of the way that things have changed, let's say in the last 5 to 7 years, there was a feeling that, and this is the substance of an exchange I had in dissent with another member of the magazine's editorial board, the kind of progressive movement, I think a lot of people in the progressive movement felt, well, if we make a big deal out of Jewish pain and suffering in the wake of October 7th, it'll be instrumentalized and used to justify the war. That's like a generous interpretation. And then there were also people who just were like, well, this is what you get when you maintain a siege and occupation. And because they were also concerned with alienating their Palestinian partners, and in America, it's very important to be a good ally. I think that people who knew that they weren't doing the right thing went along with a kind of callous line in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, because that was what they felt that their Palestinian activist partners were demanding.
So there wasn't legitimation for you to mourn your brothers and sisters in Israel.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, you can do that privately, but don't make it political, because it's dangerous politically. I mean, people have written a lot to this effect. I mean, there was a long, Naomi Klein piece in The Guardian about it. And I think that it's just wrong. Like, I think it's wrong morally. I think it's wrong politically. I think that if you're part of a political camp that values every human life, you can't say, well, it may be necessary for those human lives to be killed, but and don't talk about it because that'll be used in a bad way.
Can you give a couple of examples of responses you received, trying to explain to why you're wrong by being mourning publicly?
Yeah, I mean, they were along the lines of the kinds of things I just mentioned, that if you mourn Israeli Jewish lives, you legitimate the war. And my argument was, actually, not mourning legitimates the war. And this is because people don't understand also how, like, Israelis feel themselves to be in the world. That if you were able to mourn, then you also might be able to say to people, look, like, this, what happened is heinous and horrible, and there is another way other than living by the sword forever. But when the world's response to this is, you got what you deserved and this is even a good thing, well, you only confirm the sentence that the whole world is against us. And I think that that's basically been confirmed over and over again the last couple of years. And what progressives don't understand is that the more people in Israel feel like the whole world is against them, the harder it is for the progressive camp in Israel to make the argument that about the necessity for a territorial compromise.
How much did it actually surprise you? I'm asking that because I'm asking myself, weren't the signs already there before October 7th? I mean, the double standards many young American progressives apply to Israel and the Palestinians, how the discourse is often reduced to black and white without shades of any complexity or nuance.
I think in retrospect, I should have been less surprised. I think what surprised me most was kind of, to be maybe crass, like the tactical stupidity of the response, in the sense that I had been involved in progressive writing and journalism and thinking in America for a while. And it had seemed since, say, 2015, that people had gotten a lot more strategic and better at thinking about, well, what might be the consequences of some of the things that I say? Like, we're trying to convince people who don't already agree with us, so we have to articulate ourselves in reasonable, measured ways. And I thought that pragmatic strain in progressive thinking was more alive than it turned out to be. That, like, well, you're not going to win over, and I'm thinking also, like, you're not going to win over people to your cause when you say, actually, it's okay to kill civilians. I thought that would be the case. It turns out that also was wrong anyway.
I guess we would both assume that's obvious, isn't it? But you're not
I had assumed it
to...
was. I had assumed it was obvious, but that assumption was, I think, wrong in some ways.
What do you feel has changed the most in your life, your views, or your understanding of the world since October 7th and over the past year and a half of the war?
That's a big question. I mean, a lot. I think in some ways, my basic political commitments haven't changed. I think I articulate them differently. I mean, October 7th was a wake up for me in the sense that it made me realize how much I had taken Israel's permanence for granted. And that, saying really strident criticisms of Israel might not seem so threatening when you think, oh, Israel's invincible, which is how I think a lot of people felt mistakenly in the lead up. And in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, my first reaction was a feeling of, if Israel were to be destroyed, it would be like the greatest personal, political, spiritual catastrophe of my life. And once I understood that that was true, then a lot of different things followed. I mean, I've been doing a lot of reflection and cheshbon nefesh about like how I even may have contributed to the environment and the kind of revealed itself on October 7th. I think one of the sins that I certainly was complicit in was say the sin of abstraction, that from afar, all these questions, one state, two states, maybe, right to exist, they feel like that's the currency of the realm in America. Everyone's debating these things. But when you're more connected to what's happening on the ground, these questions are concrete. So, like hopefully my wife and I will have children, and when will have children, they will be Israeli citizens. And so it's not abstract to think, well, what would it mean for Israel to end and that them to be denationalized in the same kind of process that actually happened to my wife's family when her grandparents were in Germany and they had their nationality stripped from them. Like, it's not a game. And I think that a lot of that, I think for a lot of people in America, especially because politics is so much about being seen to be good and just, and this kind of, it's how you appear in public, the real meaning of the things that you say it's very easy for people, I think, to forget that there are material consequences and people on the other side of what they're arguing.
And you said you hope that your kids will be Israelis. And we'll just tell listeners that you're now on flights between New York and Tel Aviv because you're spending a lot of time in Tel Aviv as well. Is that an outcome of October 7th, or did you think about that beforehand?
What I meant by that is that my wife and I met several years ago in Jerusalem. She'd been living there for a long time. We're planning on moving back long before October 7th because it's a long story. For personal reasons, she came to the States. We were in the States for a little bit. I'm a graduate student, so I said, okay, we're going to move back to her. She's very involved in the progressive left-wing activist community in Jerusalem. And so I think in some ways, because of our relationship and the time that we were spending in Israel together, I experienced October 7th much more the way I think Israelis experienced it than the way that progressive American Jews who don't have a lot of personal connections do.
You hold a rather unique position in these times when discourse and reality are so polarized. I mean, how lonely does this complex position leave you these days? I mean, from both sides. Do you have a camp? Do you feel you have a camp?
It is pretty lonely. I don't feel like the camp is very big. And it's funny, when I get this question, I actually say, in some ways in Israel, the camp is, I feel I'm settling into becoming a more like normal Haaretz reader, where I'm like, yeah, I basically agree with 90% of the things in this newspaper. I say from my comfortable Tel Aviv apartment, that feels, right. Like I don't feel alienated from that perspective. I mean, sometimes there are things I really disagree with, and I think in general, being in Israel, especially now, like it can be kind of provincial. Like people lose sight of the way of the rest of the world. In the States, it's a little bit more lonely, also because my religious life and my political life are kind of misaligned. And so my wife and I are fairly traditionally observant people, but we're also pretty left wing. And so that means being in a lot of communities with people who disagree with us. That's actually gotten easier over the last year I think you have to be like, the mission of changing people's opinions within the Jewish community for me hasn't changed. And so, yeah, that means having a lot more uncomfortable conversations. It was easy to be like completely enmeshed in the progressive community and actually not have to engage with people you disagree with very much.
Because you were surrounded with people that just, agreed with you.
Exactly. I mean, to put it in like political science terms, I think that I thought that the progressive movement in America was what you might call like a counter-hegemonic movement, and that it wanted to change the common sense. And that was also true for the progressive Jewish movement. We wanted to change the common sense within the Jewish community. And this happens to a lot of movements. Movements quickly can become countercultural. And so it's not about, I want to change the minds of other people. It's, I want to be around like-minded people. And the emphasis on actually reaching out and changing minds and dialoguing gets lost. And, dialoguing requires compromise. Being able to come and share a stage or a conversation or a platform with someone who you really disagree with means in some ways, yeah, it's true. It means legitimating whatever. Like, what is it? Like, you have to legitimate them because you want to change their minds. So you have to engage with them. If you're not, if the fear, and I think this is very much common on like the American side of things, no one wants to legitimate views that they don't like. And so you don't share a stage or a platform with them, but then you also don't ever get to engage with other people.
Just to feel right. Is it
Exactly.
possible for Zionism, the way you understand it, and progressivism to coexist, or are they inherently contradictory? Because it seems that this is a question that occupies you, and in your view, the answer is yes, but that's opposed to many, maybe even most, of your former camp of progressives.
You know, over the last year, I've come to accept certain titles back, and I don't think I ever, if I'm being honest, really ever left the position of being like, I would say, a left-wing Zionist as opposed to a liberal Zionist. And you know, there's an old tradition of this. Unfortunately, it is not living as well, like it's not as vibrant as it could be. But I think that at its most basic level, Zionism is the commitment or the belief in the Jewish people's right to collective self-determination. That the realization of that right doesn't have to be exclusionary, and it's not necessarily by default exclusionary, the same way it's not, unless in like a certain philosophical sense where all communities exclude other people. But I don't think that at the philosophical level Jewish collective self-determination is more exclusionary than Czech or German, or like that's what those are nation state. That's what I also think that because I believe in this right for Jews, I also believe in that right for everyone, and that includes the Palestinians. And actually, because of the way Jews and Palestinians' fates have been linked through history, the fullest realization of Jewish self-determination requires reciprocal Palestinian self-determination. Like that's that, and that to me seems very, very obvious that if there isn't Palestinian self-determination, national self-determination in the form of a Palestinian state, there also won't be an Israel, and there's no way around that. And like again, like I think that this is fairly obvious. I do think that one of the big differences, say, between Europe, Israel, and also America, is that Americans have a kind of like national epistemological chauvinism where they think that everything should work the way America is. And so they will say, well, America is a multi-ethnic state that doesn't have an ethnos and a people and a nation and all these terms. They're antiquated. That's from like the 20th century. Look, we have this unruly pluralist place. It's a very liberal idea in like the philosophical sense, but that doesn't work for other places and other peoples. Like Palestinians want to live, if you ask most of them, in a Palestinian state that reflects Palestinian culture and history and values. The same with the Czechs and the same with the Jews, the same with the French. And this way, America is anomalous on the world stage as not being in like a nation state, basically. And I think a lot of American liberals think, well, our way is more just. It's more just not to be a nation state. Like conversations I've had with Jewish anti-Zionists in America, they say things like, I just don't think we need another nation state in the world. And my answer is usually like, well, why run that experiment in the place where two peoples both deserve states? You know, you want to abolish nation states, you can start with, there are other ones you could start with that have, you know, but that's, again, like that's, I think, like
why not Romania? Why to start with Israel?
Right. I mean, and in some ways it's a very dangerous way of thinking because those, like Romania is a good example, or Moldova, these are countries that are new and they fought for self-determination over a long period of time. It's an important form of recognition of collectivity. Americans don't have that sense of collectivity, and so they don't realize why it's important for people.
Have you lost friendships over the past year and a half?
Yeah, a lot.
Can you talk a bit about that?
You know, I'm reluctant to talk about it just because it's gotten a fair bit of airtime. You know, there's a New Yorker article about what happened at Jewish Currents, which is a publication that I worked at before. You know, I think that a lot of those friendships were friendships that were forged through common political activity. And when that political activity was no longer held in common, they became harder to sustain. I wish, you know, all those people well. I don't have residual personal animus towards them.
It took its toll, it seems, by the way you speak about it.
It was a big transition. I had spent all of my adult life in a very particular political place. And, in some ways, like going back to your question about what did you expect, I knew this was coming for a long time. I thought I would be able to have some kind of sense of control over the transition that was happening, not just on issues on Israel-Palestine, but broadly about like a whole range of other political issues, that being someone who is committed to a more traditionalist way of life versus the kind of anything goes liberalism of progressive world in America. So these were things that were a long time coming. The summer before October 7th, I was like, I'm not sure where I am right now really makes sense as the long-term political home. I would have liked to have, negotiated that without the horrific tragedy in the backdrop. But, change is part of life. So
Let's delve into the book itself now and how it connects to this conversation as well. What motivated you to write Tablets Shattered, exploring American Jewry's crisis?
I think at its core, what I wanted to do was not only, but substantially initiate a kind of intergenerational dialogue. And the book, I think, pretty explicitly addresses my parents' generation, also even my grandparents' generation. Even if I wasn't always aware of this force that was driving me, I think I wanted to explain to them why people from my age cohort couldn't believe the same things that they believed. I also wanted to learn from them and understand what they went through. This sounds kind of silly, but like I didn't really think about how did it impact my father that he was bar mitzvahed the year of the Yom Kippur War in the December that followed it. I don't know. Like that seems pretty substantial. And maybe that had some impact on his politics and how he understood Israel. And so in some ways, even if I was trying to convince them, I also, or communicate with that generation, I also, through the process and also through reading, was learning from them. And in that way, like also it was enriching. I mean, even now, one of the things I hope the book does is kind of spur those intergenerational conversations between, say, millennials and Gen Zers and their parents who might have trouble communicating with them over politics.
Your main argument in the book is that three core pillars have shaped and sustained American Jewish identity since World War II. Americanism is the first one, Zionism the second, and liberalism, and that all three are now eroding. Walk us through your analysis. I mean, how did these pillars take root and what's causing them to weaken today?
So Americanism was kind of the first pillar to take shape. And by Americanism, I mean a certain kind of American Jewish exceptionalism, the idea, and this is very common among American Jews, that America is a great country and that its exceptional greatness has been confirmed by the Jewish experience, especially compared to how Jews were treated in other countries. That's true from before the Holocaust. Obviously, America's role in defeating Nazism further proved America's goodness, America's subsequent support for Israel, the difference between America and, say, the Soviet Union, which is where lots of other, like the other half in some ways of the Jewish people was for a long period of time, and also the incredible upward mobility that American Jews experienced. All of that contribute to this sense that there's never been a place like America. And what's so interesting about this idea is that it's shared across it's one of the few things that's shared across the entirety of the American Jewish religious and even some sense political spectrum. So a liberal justice like Ruth Bader Ginsburg has said things to this effect, but also the father of neoconservatism, Norman Podhoretz. The reform movement has made statements to that effect, and also the Satmar Hasidic community, refers to America as a malchut shel chesed, like a kind of just rule or reign.
Actually, it even extends to Israel. I think that, I was brought up with the idea that America is the greatest country on earth. I mean, we envied America as our ally.
Right. I think that's true. I think that's true too. In America, and especially within the majority of American Jews, that faith in America has been shaken by a lot of things. Trump's election is one of them, the return of kind of right-wing authoritarian populism, kleptocracy, political diseases that people thought wouldn't come here. The rise of anti-Semitism and its reappearance in violent forms is something that I think no one really expected. And this this is something that I'm now prepared to acknowledge more than I was before is happening across the left-right divide. And so, yes, it's true that the most violent attack ever on Jews in America was the 2018 Tree of Life massacre in Pittsburgh. But it's also true that there's a kind of like almost routine violence exhibited towards Jews, say in a place like New York City, especially that's really increased since October 7th. And I think that the loss of personal security, even in the streets for American Jews, is something that I don't think very many of us would have imagined. And then the third thing that I think has eroded America, this is more on the Americanism, more on the liberal side of things, is a way of thinking about American history in which America appears as kind of flawed from the beginning, that it has an original sin it can't atone for, being slavery. Over the last decade or so, American liberals have been very preoccupied with the legacies of slavery and racism. I think that's a good thing generally, but it's part of what has shaken a kind of, in some ways, the exceptionalism has gone the other way, which is that America is like an exceptionally bad country born in sin, an evil empire. So that's the Americanism pillar.
The second pillar is Zionism. Take us there.
Zionism is more straightforward, but I actually don't mean Zionism in the sense of, do you believe that Israel should exist or not exist? What I really mean is that I think American Jews, as the second half of the 20th century wore on, lost, surrendered, distanced themselves from religious tradition. And in its place, they put Israel. Israel as the culmination of all of Jewish history, Israel also as a moral beacon, as a kind of inspiration. That is just not the way most American Jews think about Israel right now. They don't see it as a mirror of their values. I think some Jews, American Jews, still see it as the culmination of Jewish history and see it in kind of spiritual redemptive terms too, but it's not consensus the way it was. And even if before that consensus was kind of enforced by the communal institutions, Israel is probably the greatest source of division in American Jewish life instead of its unifying.
And you argue that in the past, Zionism was a kind of substitute for like the traditional Orthodox life that many more secular Jews left. And then they found Zionism like instead in a way.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, Zionism enabled American Jews to both be Jewish and be American, because keeping halakha, keeping Shabbat, that takes you outside of the mainstream of American Jewish society. Donating to AIPAC, every group has their own lobby. It fit in the American model of identity really well. It also meant that a lot of the kind of more philosophical and theological questions that had been debated for centuries, really at the core of the questions of Jewish modernity, could be kind of swept aside. And there's this great quote that I have in the book from the Jewish American literary critic Irving Howe, who says that Israel and Zionism, I'm paraphrasing, enabled American Jews to postpone that reconsideration of their Jewishness, which the American condition required. So, okay, all these complicated questions, there's actually like this concrete nation, and that's actually much easier to bind an identity to.
And then there's a third pillar, which is liberalism.
Yes, and the third pillar is liberalism. I don't mean political liberalism. I mean religious liberalism. And there are kind of three main characteristics to religious liberalism. One is that the individual is at the center of their religious experience rather than the community. The question is that people walk around, it's like, what do I get out of religious community? Not what do I do with others? Very consumerist, capitalist mentality, very common in America. As a consequence, the logic of the relationship to liberal religion is one of choice rather than the more traditional concept of obligation or mitzvah. So most liberal Jews basically say, I choose to do this, I choose to do that, I do what I like, what fits, not operating out of any grand source of obligation. And then the last part of this, of religious liberalism, is a kind, at its best, a pluralism, which has served American Judaism really well, but at its worst, a certain kind of relativism, which makes it very hard for American Jews, especially American Jewish parents, to say to their children something like, it's important for me that you live a Jewish life more than the other lifestyle options on like the infinite marketplace of experience that America affords. And so I think that part of why this pillar has crumbled is that for a lot of American Jews, it's very hard for them to give reasons about why they should continue to be Jewish in coherent ways.
So how does this collapse of the three big pillars that you see of Jewish identity, Americanism, Zionism, and liberalism, influence young Jews?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it depends on where the young Jews are coming from. I mean, I would say, to generalize maybe crudely, that whereas, say, in my parents' generation, or maybe even in my grandparents' generation, American Jewish life was characterized by a kind of spectrum of denominations that went from, say, like a very liberal reform all the way through to, orthodoxy, with different nodes on the way that like you could stop in. I think that American Jewish life for, say, people under like 20, I don't know. This is anecdata, not hard fact. I think the experience is kind of bifurcated into people who are growing up with, say, a framework of kind of normative traditionalism, not necessarily orthodox, but in the sense like sociologically orthodox or orthodox adjacent. And then those are, kids who grow up through day schools, whose families regularly attend synagogue, who maybe go to Jewish summer camp. And then you have a kind of like essentially disaffiliated segment of the Jewish world who, only a third of American Jews belong to synagogues. This is something that most people don't know. So like that's the majority of American Jews who are kind of have some attenuated relationship to Jewish communal practice. I think for, let's say for young people who are coming from those communities, they don't have very clear, precise, or coherent ideas of what it means to be Jewish. I mean, I'll give an example of where this comes to be expressed. Some people who are involved in, say, like the progressive Jewish movement of the 2010s were people like myself who basically grew up in the mainline affiliated Jewish community, day school, parents involved in the communal institutions, and then got politically disillusioned through either spending time actually in Israel or other kinds of experience going to college, and ended up being mobilized around the issue that way. I actually think that might characterize some of the leaders of those groups, but I actually think the more common experience are people who didn't grow up with strong Jewish identities and who sought out progressive Jewish groups because those were the forms of Jewishness that they felt conformed to their values. The progressive values start first, and the Jewishness happens second because people want like community and meaning.
I'm curious, as someone who knows these people quite well, do you think that young Jews who participated in anti-Israel protests on campuses, holding Shabbat services and Passover Seders together in the encampments and singing Jewish songs, were they expressing an authentic part of their Jewish identity, or was it a political use of their Jewish identity to justify the ideology they already believe in?
I don't think very many people are doing it cynically, but I think that the way that I think about it is that there are some people, and I understand them, and because they are my friends, who feel so aggrieved that the beautiful Jewish tradition that they know has come to be associated with the violence that Israel is doing in the West Bank and Gaza. And so they want to, in some sense, reclaim the symbols of Jewishness from Israel, from state violence. And the way that they do that is through the songs and the ritual and that kind of thing. Now, there obviously is an instrumental part of it, which is, how can you call us anti-Semitic? We're lighting Shabbat candles, we built a sukkah. And then there are also people who never thought that Jewishness could be relevant to their actual lives. And so when they see a form of Jewishness that's like, we oppose all forms of state violence and liberation for all people, they're like, oh, I already believe those things. And so here's a form of Jewish practice that I can join because I never heard of this before. And they get attracted to that kind of expression. I don't think, this is going to maybe get me in trouble for saying, I don't think that people are thinking that hard about the consequences of these things. I mean, this is something that came out as I was reporting, as I worked on the book. I wanted to hear, what is the philosophy behind this? Why is ritual appearing in these kinds of protests? And it was basically it's a way of showing that we're really Jewish, but also opposing things we think are immoral. And there's not so much more of a theory behind it than that. And,
you couldn't find a philosophy in your conversations with them.
I didn't find a very coherent philosophy. And I think there are lots of reasons for that. I don't think I had a very coherent philosophy either for a long time, partially because of the way that all of these things are abstract. I mean, I think about a quote that of an activist who said something to me in the book that I think captures this a little bit, which is, she said, I just wish that our Jewish identity wouldn't be tied to a nation state. That's like an interesting wish, but it's not the reality. So you have to live in the reality.
And that's one of the interesting observations that you make in your book, how central Israel remains to young Jewish identity, whether they support it or oppose it. It's still, the reference point, the anchor of their connection. So in that sense, one could argue that the truly radical shift, the one that should concern us or me even more, isn't from those who actively oppose Israel, as frustrating as it could be for me as an Israeli, but rather from those who feel no emotional connection to Israel.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's funny because one of the things people use these terms interchangeably in the kind of progressive world of diasporist and anti-Zionist, but I'm like, you're not a diasporist if the main object of your politics is Israel. You've just inverted Zionism, and it's not like moving beyond Israel. Like you said, one of the arguments I make in the book is I don't think that's possible because the majority of Jews in the world live in Israel or are going to live in Israel very soon. And so if you are engaging in like a Jewish identity politics, then you have to reckon with where the majority of Jews live. In some ways, what you'd said though is like is kind of the way that, let's say, like the Israeli foreign policy under Netanyahu is basically operated, which is just that actually most American Jews don't really care and are disconnected. I mean, Owen Dermer had this quote where he was like, we should really be focusing on the evangelicals because that's where like the money and the activity is. And when people get mad about Netanyahu for like alienating American Jews, he doesn't say this outright, but he's basically being like, it doesn't matter. I don't think he's right, but he's also not wrong in the sense that American Jews matter much less than I think they do to what happens in Israel.
On a broader context, what strategies do you think are effective in reaching young Jews who feel disconnected from their Jewish heritage? I mean, obviously, you had a strong foundation because of your upbringing, despite the criticism you have of it. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But what about others, who lack that background?
I've gotten this question a lot from like the rabbis that I've spoken to as I've taken the book on tour. And the answer that I've tried to give is most American Jews, and including young American Jews, are taught to engage with the world critically, inquisitively, to look at the root of things, to turn them over, to debate them, with one exception, which is their Jewishness. That the American, and this is part of my criticism of American like mainstream Jewish education, treats Israel and Judaism as kind of this big exception to the way we relate to everything else in our lives. American Jews are lawyers, doctors, academics, people who think in some sense for a living. And then when it comes to their own religion, they're basically told like, it's better that you not think, or no one's taught how to think. The French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas has this phrase, religion for adults. And I think that American Judaism in a lot of ways has never been a religion for adults, which makes it really hard for young adults coming up into maturity to know how to relate to it. I mean, I would say I think probably the most effective forms of outreach are enabling people or young people to relate to Judaism the way they would to anything they care a lot about in their lives, which is to say seriously and intellectually honestly.
You argue that, the upbringing lacks nuance and complexity. So what kind of school would you want your kids to attend? I mean, what would that ideal school look like? I'm being a pushy Israeli, right? Talking about your unborn children.
Depends. One of the things, it's funny. My wife and I talk a lot about this, getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but in the sense that, I think that having the basics is really important. And so that includes the basics of Jewish religion, of law, tradition, halacha, but also, Jewish philosophy. These are things that I think most American Jews never encounter. If they do at all, it's usually in college by then. And that's only for people who are kind of interested in returning to their roots. And so, I mean, the other thing that I would just say is language also matters, and language is really important. I don't think that my life would certainly not be the way it was if I hadn't gotten a good Hebrew education as a child, which meant that as I spent more time in Israel, it took a very short period of time to pick it up. And having the linguistic skills are hugely important because it means that you can open basically any Jewish text and engage with it. Contrary to what some of the diaspora say about Hebrew being invented, Hebrew has been the lingua franca of intercommunal Jewish exchange for centuries. And it's what a vast literature of thought, musar, halakha, like reflections have all been written in. If you want to have any access to that at all, basically in an authentic way, you need to have the language skills. And I think those two things like should usually do the trick. I mean, my other elements of the educational curriculum would be different depending on the context. I think in Israel, there is a lack of education about pluralism and about different kinds of Judaism. And that's been hugely damaging to the Israeli public sphere. I think in America, it's maybe the opposite, which is that I think in America, American Jews are too easy to adopt, to see American values and Jewish values as identical. And I think the communities that are flourishing the most in America are those that take some distance away from America and say, well, if America is a consumerist society, maybe maybe Jewish values means holding ourselves at a distance from consumerism. But that could also apply in Israel, but like it's also less materialist society, so it's less relevant.
You criticize not only how Jewish education is in American schools, Jewish American schools, but also you criticize American Jewish schools for being, in your view, too Zionistic. Allow me to push back a little. I mean, I'm trying to capture the opposing perspective here. One can argue that in childhood, kids should be instilled with a basic love and warmth for Israel without criticism. And there will be plenty of time for that later when they grow up. And that early impressions are deeply formative, what we call girsa de enkuta, the version of your early childhood. How would you respond to that?
I mean, I'm like, well, it works for me, but but I think the argument I actually am making in the book isn't that a love for like Avat Yisrael is not a value that we should teach our children. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that my education had a maybe overemphasis on Avat Yisrael to the detriment of basically anything else, which meant that as I moved into the world as a young adult, I wasn't able to modulate my experiences with a broader wealth of Jewish knowledge. I mean, I've had people, rabbis even say like, how are you still engaged in these things? My children don't want anything to do with it. And I'm like, well, I know their kids and I grew up very similar to their kids. And because Israel is the only thing that they really took with them from their education, once they say, well, it doesn't even have to do with them becoming anti-Israel activists. It's like once I feel ambivalent about this thing or it makes me uncomfortable and they turn away from it, they don't have necessarily anything else to really turn to. I think that's true even all the way going up to some, I would say like, I think modern Orthodox communities are doing better than this, but certainly everyone like religiously leftward from modern Orthodoxy has this problem. Like, I mean, well, to the extent that conservative day schools will continue to exist, like you don't have students coming out of these institutions with thick enough Jewish identities to weather the disappointment that any person inevitably has when they encounter reality. Because it's always more complicated than the idealized version they grew up with.
You describe in the book how your personal religious and cultural practices changed as a result of your research and writing journey. Not your political views, but the practices and the religious life that you live. Could you talk to me a bit about that? I find that fascinating.
Sure. I mean, I think, writing this book required a lot of research, and I found myself spending hours a day reading about Jewish history and Jewish philosophy. And, it occurred to me like, well, I'm doing this because I really care about the Jewish future. And it seems strange to do all this work and think about Jewishness all day and not participate more in the traditional rhythms of Jewish life, the Jewish calendar, the Jewish week, and so over time, and this is also something, I mean, it also has to do with my relationship with my wife. When we met very early on, we both said, we've been looking for a partner to become more observant. We both missed that kind of more traditional way of living that, I think a lot of people who grow up with a little bit of a traditional background sometimes distance themselves in their 20s, then come back to when they start to think about a family. And yeah, basically from from very early on, we in some ways returned to tradition, a more traditional way of life together. I mean, we're never that far from it. I mean, we're not like, it's not as dramatic as it sounds, but I think for me, it was maybe more in the sense that being more observant definitely marked me out more from the progressive milieu than I had been before, where I think that people like American liberals, and I think liberals generally, have a skepticism of religion. Like, that's fair. Like, you believe in those fairy tales. And I'm like, well, the theological conversation, like, that's for another day. But I don't think that there's such a big contradiction here, actually.
Have any readers' responses to Tablets Shattered particularly resonated with you or surprised you?
I mean, one funny thing that's happened that I didn't expect is that people email me and say things like, because of your book, I've decided to keep Shabbat, or I've decided to join the board of my synagogue, or I'm becoming more involved, or I'm doing more rituals. Like, I had no intention of thinking that that's
It
what the
wasn't a
book.
missionary book.
No, not at all. And in a weird way, I think it has been a little bit. I've also, gotten a lot of emails from people who grew up fairly similar to me and have said, well, you really captured the way we grew up. And we're all asking ourselves this question of how to be Jewish in a world where it's not just that we can't go back to the way we grew up if it was around. It's like it doesn't exist anymore. The things have changed. And so we have to find new ways to live. Those have been among the more positive responses.
You're spending quite a lot of time in Tel Aviv these days. Tell me a bit about that experience. What drew you and your wife back to Israel?
I mean, we had met there, and we'd always planned on moving back to Israel. We got a little delayed for some personal reasons. We met in Jerusalem, and we're Yerushalmim b'neshama, but we're really Jerusalemites in our hearts. But we wanted a little bit of a break because Jerusalem is so intense. And then so we decided to live in Tel Aviv. And I mean, I think we both wanted to go back because that's where our political community really is. And we wanted to get back involved in the kind of work that we had done. And also because it felt easier to do that from there. I mean, one, if we're going to talk about Israel all the time, might as well be there instead of being from afar, which is how things were before and how I felt for a long time. And then also, and when I say this to Israelis, they're always like, what are you talking about? It's like, I felt like it was actually easier to be a leftist in Tel Aviv because, I mean, one, whatever, it's Tel Aviv, but in Israel, even broadly, like it would have been true if we were in Jerusalem, in the sense that I didn't have to worry showing up to a protest and seeing people who were carrying slogans that I thought were like anti-Semitic or abhorrent or violent, and not having to like worry that people are going to show up to protests with like Hezbollah flags the way that they do in, say, Washington Square Park, actually was a really meaningful difference. And I thought, I don't want to be like, I'm by nature a person who wants to end the occupation, wanted the war to end, wants Israel to be a just country. I don't want to spend my time like arguing with insane people in America who are anti-Semitic or whatever. Like, that's not what I want, or attacking the left. Like, that wasn't something that I wanted to do with my life. And I felt like the move was in some ways, it became more urgent once that was the situation, because it felt like, okay, well, at least we can be ourselves here.
What gives you optimism about the future of Jewish life in America? You're smiling. If there is optimism.
No, I think I got pegged as someone who is all doom and gloom. I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I mean, one thing you could say is, if you compared the sociological trends of American Jews to, say, other non-Jews who came over from Europe at the same period of time, Italians, Poles, it's amazing that there are still Jews. That's crazy. It's almost a miracle. Like, very few people, other than with their last names, who came over, whose forebears came over in the 1880s, have anything but the most kind of superficial relationship to their heritage. And as much as I criticize liberal Judaism, it happens to be the case that like Jews remain pretty Jewish, even though there's been a lot of time has passed. So that's great. I also think that there's a kind of, within the Orthodox and even the Haredi world, there's a kind of continual re-experiencing of the fundamental kind of, how do I put this, like rupture of Jewish modernity, where people who grew up within tradition leave. And one of the most interesting things I think in Jewish life is some of the creative energy that formerly religious, like the Tlashim, as they say in Israel, are injecting into American Jewish life. There was, comedians who grew up with more traditional backgrounds who are kind of carrying the torch of a certain kind of Jewish culture. There's also probably like a lot more Torah being learned by a lot more people in America than there ever was. You see women Orthodox rabbis being ordained. There's a huge amount of religious creativity that's happening. I'm not sure, like how sustainable it will all be. And even then, these aren't things that like your average American Jew really ever encounters. These are people who are kind of within the communal. But, all of those to me are accomplishments of American Judaism.
We've nearly reached the end of our conversation, but before that, we have our Jewish Crossroads questionnaire, 5 quick and fun questions. Are you ready, Joshua?
Yeah, yalla.
What's your earliest Jewish memory?
My earliest Jewish memory. I don't know. I don't know how old I was. I mean, this will give you a sense. I think I write about it or maybe I cut it in the book. My earliest Jewish memory is celebrating Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom HaZikaron in my day school, because we would do the transition very fast. So go from the sadness and remember they taught us to sing this very sad song, Ma Varech. And we had to learn the words and memorize them. We're standing there. I must have been 7 with white shirt and everything. And then the next day would be a kind of festival, eat falafel. So that was probably my earliest. That, and also being really bored in morning services and chipping the paint off the wall as a child, because we prayed every morning in school.
If you could meet any Jewish figure from history, ancient or modern, who would it be and why?
Wow, that's such a good question. That's really tough. I'm going to go with an unconventional one just because I've been thinking a lot about him recently, which is I'd be curious to talk to Shimon Dubnov, which I think Israelis think that's just the street, but who is actually a scholar, a very important scholar of Jewish nationalism, and also a political leader of a non-Zionist nationalist movement in the Tsarist Empire. And he was murdered by the Nazis. And I would be very curious to hear what he thought about Jews as a nation, and ask him what he would think of the future would look. I don't know. It'd be funny to have. He died before he could see so many significant changes. I'd be curious to know what he'd think about his name being on streets in Israel and things like that.
And coffee shops.
Coffee shops. Yeah.
What is your favorite or most meaningful Jewish tradition?
I think by far the most important practice is keeping Shabbat. Keeping Shabbat strictly. When I grew up, we didn't keep Shabbat according to halacha. We went to synagogue, but then we would, do other things. And I used to joke we were Zocher Shabbat, but not
Shomer Shabbat.
Zocher Shabbos, not Shomer Shabbos. And being fully Shomer Shabbos is one, I would be insane without it. To just be no phone, no computer. You really do get to experience something very different about the world, and spend time with family and the people you love. And also, being Shomer Shabbat in Tel Aviv, it's I get to walk, I just walk around a lot. Walk to the beach, look at the waves, walk back. It's a very, very special time. It's been probably the best decision I made.
If you could jump 100 years into the future in one sentence, what would you hope to see for the Jewish people?
I would hope to see that the Jewish people living in the state of Israel are doing so in a flourishing democracy that has internationally recognized borders and neighborly peace with the surrounding countries in the region.
What's one Jewish word, Hebrew, English, Yiddish, whatever, that feels particularly meaningful to you right now?
Wow. That's a good question too. I mean, the word that my wife and I keep saying to each other is just hazaya. Just there's no other way to think about.
Translate it. You're the American one. Translate that to English. Insanity?
Insanity. Everything just feels insane all the time. And so that's how you wait, every morning you wake up and there's more insanity is kind of the feeling. And saying, and insanity doesn't have the same mouth feel.
Yeah, it isn't.
Right. The other word I was thinking was tachlis. I'm that, that's also, it's a good Yiddish one, but I think hazayam is the reality we live in.
Joshua Leifer, toda. Thank you for this fascinating conversation.
It was a pleasure.
That's it for this episode of Jewish Crossroads. We'd love to hear from you, so feel free to write to us at jewishcrossroadspod@gmail.com. Thank you to Tomer Atzabi Bar, who edited this chapter. We'll see you next time, same place, same journey, with a new voice. See you soon.